Well, thank you very much indeed, David, and welcome all of you. And thank you very much indeed for logging in. I think I said good evening, but of course it could be good morning or good afternoon, depending on which part of the world you're watching from. From my point of view, particularly delighted that some people from Canada are looking in, because my mother was Canadian, Kinistino, Saskatchewan, 1917. Her father, my grandfather, having been invalided out of the army, clearly whatever he had wasn't terribly serious, because my mother was born exactly 10 months later. However, I'm going to talk this evening about the Russian Civil War. Technically and officially, it lasted from 1917 until 1920, but there were still foreign troops on Russian territory right up until 1922. What was it about? It was a battle, a campaign, a fight, a war between the Bolsheviks, the communists, who were in the process of taking over the country, and a whole plethora of monarchists, unreconstructed monarchists who wanted the Tsar back, people who wanted a constitutional monarchy on the British style, Democrats, socialists, power brokers, breakaway nationalists, mercenaries, dubious chancers, and of course the Allied intervention force. Like all civil wars, it became extremely unpleasant. There were atrocities on both sides. There was no quarter given. It probably killed about 500,000 Russians, and there were probably another 2 million casualties as well as that. Now, of course, during the First World War, the Allies, of course, want Russia in the war, and they want to keep Russia in the war. And in 1915, the British built the port of Murmansk right up here. Now, the idea there was that the British could deliver material, ammunition, equipment, clothing to keep the Russians in the war. So they built the port of Murmansk. The Russians then built a railway line, 800 miles all the way down to St. Petersburg, which they'd renamed Petrograd, the capital, from where they would distribute the stores and the equipment where needed. The railway line, the lines were supplied by the British. The actual labor was done by German prisoners of war. Now, most of us know about the Burma-Siam Railway in the Second World War and the appalling conditions in which prisoners of war had to work. And this one was just as bad. The number of, huge number, we don't really know how many, German prisoners died through malnutrition, disease, and ill treatment until they got the railway built. Now, of course, it was the February Revolution that led to the Tsar abdicating. Things were not going well in the war. There were bread riots. Now, when we say bread riots, these were riots because people weren't getting enough to eat. In fact, there was plenty of food available. The problem was that the administration was so corrupt and incompetent that it couldn't get the food to the places where it was needed. And therefore, there was rioting. There was communism spreading amongst the army. The American War Department sent in experts to get the railways running again, because the railways were the main means of distributing food. In fact, by the time they started to get the railways organized, it was too late. The Tsar telephoned all his army commanders and said, "Will you support me?" And they all said, "Terribly sorry, Your Majesty, but no." So he abdicated on the 15th of March, 1917, and that led to a provisional government, eventually led by a chap called Kerensky. Kerensky was a socialist, but he wasn't an extremist. He certainly was a long way from being a Bolshevik or a communist. What did for Kerensky's government was that he tried to stay in the war. He felt that it would be dishonorable to let down the Allies, the British and the French, and of course the Americans who'd come into the war in April. And because of that, that led to what's called the October Revolution. Now, it's really the November Revolution because the Russians were still on the old calendar, but it's always called the October Revolution. And that's where the Bolsheviks, the extremists, the communists, began to seize power from the provisional government. And as soon as they'd done that, they started to negotiate with the Germans as to an armistice. Shortly after that, in December, while these negotiations between the Bolshevik government and the Germans are going on, the war, of course, is still going on, the British decided that while they would prefer the anti-Bolsheviks to run the country, at the same time, they hoped that the Bolsheviks would stay in the war. It was important, as far as the Allies were concerned, that they did stay in the war because, of course, the Eastern Front was occupying the attention of a very large number of German divisions. And the fear was that if Russia leaves the war, then those divisions will be available for the Western Front. And it's that, in my opinion, why there was no haven for the Tsar. Now, a number of books, a number of accounts, a number of historians say, well, the reason the Tsar was never taken to exile in England, something that the provisional government would have allowed, or almost certainly would have allowed, it was, and we're told that this was because the King George V, was terrified there'd be a communist uprising in England. Well, that is nonsense. There was never any question of a communist uprising in England. Traditionally, the British, and still indeed, eschew extremes, of whether it's extremes of the right or extremes of the left. That wasn't going to happen. The reason I believe, it's only my opinion, that the British didn't insist on taking the Tsar off in exile was simply as a sop to the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks wanted to retain the Tsar, presumably as a bargaining tool for later on. Of course, we know that that didn't quite work out. But that, I think, is why the Tsar wasn't brought to exile in Hampshire or wherever. So the British want to keep the Bolsheviks in the war, but they are concerned about Murmansk. Now, this British port in Murmansk, huge amount of stores, huge amounts of material have been delivered to Murmansk. A lot of it has not been sent down to Petrograd, not because there was anything wrong with the railways, but simply because with the upheaval of the clashes between Bolsheviks and anti-Bolsheviks, a lot of this kit had not been moved out of Murmansk. And the British are concerned that the Germans might come up through Finland and take it. So the first thing they did was they sent a battleship, a British battleship, and a cruiser and some armed trawlers. And that was in March 1918. So the war's still going on. They arrive in Murmansk with 130 Royal Marines who are going to guard the port and the stores therein. Now, this was approved by the Bolsheviks. The British said to Trotsky. Trotsky was then really the second most important person, second only to Lenin. This is before Stalin really appears on the scene. So Trotsky says, yes, he's quite happy for the British to land troops and provide a little naval force to prevent the Germans from seizing these stores. Well, then in March, 3rd of March 1918, the Bolsheviks finally do sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And that means that they're out of the war. So what's going to happen now? Instead of guarding these stores in the port against the Germans, we're now going to guard them against the Bolsheviks, because the British have now decided that they will support the anti-Bolsheviks rather than trying to come to terms with the Bolsheviks. We probably couldn't have come to terms with them at that particular time. So more Royal Marines are landed. Major General Maynard, British, lands with 2,000 men. That's a mixture of British, French, Serbian, and Finnish troops. Finland, of course, had broken away from the Russian Empire in 1918, and they're there to protect Murmansk, and they are told 250 miles of the railway, all the way down, not all the way down to Petrograd, but the first 250 miles. A British seaplane carrier appears, one of the few we had at that point. There is then a white coup in Archangel. Now, Archangel is the other port, sort of opposite Murmansk, difficult to see on this small map. There's a white coup. The Bolsheviks are kicked out of Archangel. So Lieutenant General Frederick Poole, British general, with some British troops and a French battalion. He lands in Archangel. So we've now got British and Allied troops in Murmansk, originally to protect it from the Germans, now to protect it from the Bolsheviks, and British and French troops in Archangel. And this is the time when the Allies, which is really the British and the French, and the Americans somewhat reluctantly, but they come in as well, and they decide there will be an Allied intervention force. That's when the name is coined, and they will intervene in the Civil War on the side of what are known as the White Russians. These are the anti-Bolsheviks. And in September, Tiny Ironside, then a Major General Ironside, of course, later on in the Second World War, beginning of the Second World War, is briefly the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, the professional head of the army. Of course, because of the treaty, the Germans are now able to transfer 35 divisions to the Western Front. And this, as you all know, is the Kaiserschlacht, that series of offensives starting in March 1918, when the Germans are desperately trying to win the war, the last shot at winning the war. And as we know, they fired their last bolt, and there wasn't another bolt to fire. So the Allied intervention force consists of 2 British divisions. Now, I've said British divisions. They weren't actually deployed as divisions. There were a number of semi-independent units and conglomerations of units all around the periphery of Russia. But in numbers, they roughly added up to 2 British divisions. 2 Japanese divisions. Now, these were as divisions. They appeared. There was a Canadian brigade from the Western Front. There was an American brigade, an Italian brigade, a Chinese brigade, a French demi-brigade, which is 2 battalions, and the Czech Legion. I'll explain what the Czech Legion was in a moment. There was also Royal Naval detachments in the Baltic, in the Black Sea, and in the Caspian. There was, of course, artillery, tanks spread around these various units, and of course the Royal Air Force. The first time that British troops actually fired a shot was in September, when they pushed back. Bolshevik forces were approaching on Murmansk, and they were pushed back relatively easily, pushed back 25 miles away from Murmansk. And at the same time, the Americans that I talked about were landing in Archangel. And then on 11th of November 1918, the Germans seek an armistice. The war's over, so any question of re-establishing the Eastern Front is out of the question. And by January 1919, there were 30,000 anti-Bolshevik forces, and by March, 500,000. Now, as far as the Allied intervention force is concerned, they did not all have the same agenda. The whole thing was very rapidly cobbled together, sent off to not just to northern Russia, but down in the Caucasus as well. They hadn't really got a common agenda. The Americans, for example, said that they were prepared to protect American property. They would evacuate American citizens. They were not, at this stage, prepared to fight the Bolsheviks. And a number of the other contingents said the same thing. There was briefly a Greek contingent that appeared for a couple of weeks and then disappeared again. But in the first 6 months, the Allies, that's mainly the British and the French, provided 1 million rifles, 15,000 machine guns, 700 artillery pieces, 800 million rounds of ammunition, and clothing and equipment for 500,000 men. So there's a huge provision of materiel to the White Russians. And in some ways, that was almost more important than the presence of troops. The troops there, of course, were psychologically, that was a powerful factor for the White Russians, but it was the provision of all this kit that was really equally as important. I'm going to be now terribly Anglo-centric. and I know a lot of our viewers are not necessarily English, but just briefly to explain what the British contribution was. In North Russia, commanded by Tiny Ironside, there is one brigade, the 236 Infantry Brigade. It used to be 75 Brigade when it was on the Western Front. 17th Kings, 6 Green Hards, 13 Green Hards, 11 Royal Sussex. 6 Green Hards were a territorial force battalion. All the rest were New Army battalions. And then enforced troops, 6th Royal Marine Light Infantry, they're mainly to guard the kit and guard the port. 2nd 10th Royal Scots, which was a cyclist battalion. I suppose useful when the ground freezes. I wouldn't want to be one. 5th 2nd Manchesters and a company of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. The Slav British Allied Legion. Now, this was a hodgepodge cobbled together mainly of Poles, but other Slavs as well. A regiment of Canadian artillery and a squadron of the Royal Air Force. And then over in Archangel, the Archangel garrison was the 2nd 7th Durham Light Infantry. So you'll see there's a complete mixture. There's some territorial force, some New Army, and actually no regular battalions up in the north. Then down in the Caucasus, the North Persia force, that had a regular battalion, the Irish Fusiliers, Guides Cavalry, Indian Army, Deoli, Rajputana, Gurkhas, Punjabis, all obviously Indian Army, Battalion of the Royal Horse Artillery, Battery of the Royal Horse Artillery. S&M, by the way, is not an extraordinary perversion. It stands for Sappers and Miners, and it's the Indian equivalent of the Royal Engineers, and a motor battery of the Machine Gun Corps. And they were reinforced again from Mesopotamia by 2 regular battalions, Royal Berks and York and Lancs. At this stage, of course, there's really no difference between regular battalions, territorial force battalions, and New Army battalions. And there's really no difference between volunteers in the early part of the war and conscripts. All these battalions are pretty much of a muchness by now. And then there's the Warwicks, 7th Gloucesters, 9th Worcesters, and the 7th North Staffordshires, again with a company of the Machine Gun Corps and a trench mortar battery, and they're all down in the Caucasus. And then you've got in Baku. Now Baku is on the Caspian, and that was held by the East Series, a regular battalion, and a Punjabi battalion from the Indian Army, and a light cavalry regiment from the Indian Army. In Siberia, although most of the fighting actually is in Siberia because of the Trans-Siberian Railway, and I'll talk about it in a moment, the British combat troops were just 2 battalions, 25th Middlesex and the 1st 9th Hampshires. In all theatres, the Royal Navy was represented. The Royal Navy had a squadron in the Baltic. They had a squadron in the Black Sea. They had a flotilla in the Caspian. And before you ask, how the hell did they get to the Caspian? They captured Batumi. Now, Batumi's on the Black Sea. Batumi was captured, and from Batumi, in lorries, they managed to ship across gunboats for this flotilla, and in a separate convoy, the guns. So the gunboats went first, followed by naval guns, which are fitted onto the ships, and then you had a flotilla in the Caspian. The Navy also operated armored trains. Now, you don't normally associate sailors with trains, but because the trains had on them guns which were naval guns taken off ships and fitted on the trains, they were operated largely by the Navy. The Royal Air Force had squadrons in each location, Murmansk, Archangel, down in the Caucasus. The Royal Tank Regiment had detachments spread all over the place in really quite small troops, so 3 or 4 tanks here, there, and everywhere else, both with British forces and White Russian forces. And of course, there was also the support and administrative units, engineers, signals, transport, medical, and service, and the rest. Now, I mentioned the Czech Legion. Now, what is now Czechoslovakia, what is now Slovakia and the Czech Republic, was, of course, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But the Czechs, particularly under Thomas Masaryk, had been agitating for a very long time for separate recognition of the Czechs. A lot of them didn't want to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And in 1916, when the war is going on, Austro-Hungarians, of course, are fighting the Russians, the Czechs managed to persuade the Tsar that he should form a Czech brigade. And that's what they did. They formed it at the beginning of 1917. It was composed mainly of Czech prisoners of war from the Austro-Hungarian army, prisoners in Russia. They were released to join this Czech brigade, and deserters from battalions or regiments of the Austro-Hungarian army. Now along comes the first revolution and the provisional government. What are we going to do with these people? Well, they say, okay, what we'll do is we'll let the Czech Legion move along the Trans-Siberian Railway to Vladivostok over on the Pacific, and then the Royal Navy will ship them round to the Western Front, where they will come under the command of the French and they will fight the Germans. And by this time, there were 60,000 strong. Well, of course, now there's the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, so Russia is out of the war. But the Bolsheviks did agree that the Czech Legion could move off down to Vladivostok and the British would take them away, except that they would be required to hand in their weapons, and they could only retain sufficient weapons to defend the train. That all went wrong because the attitude of the Bolsheviks changed. There were a number of skirmishes between the Czech Legion and the Bolshevik authorities, and eventually the Czech Legion simply took control of the Trans-Siberian Railway from Penza, which is 400 miles southeast of Moscow, all the way down to Vladivostok. Now, all the way along the railway, because the Trans-Siberian Railway is the main way of transporting east to west, west to east, and all along the railway, there were dumps of stores, Allied stores. 600,000 tons were dumped in various depots along the Trans-Siberian Railway to be used by the White Russians and the Allied intervention force. So by the Czech Legion seizing the Trans-Siberian Railway, they were actually in quite a powerful, quite a strong position. The commander of the Czech Legion was a chap called Michael Detrix. He had actually been a Tsarist general, although he was a Czech. He was very much a monarchist. He wanted the Tsar back, none of this liberalization nonsense. He was anti-Semitic. He was very strongly religious. And he fell out basically with Kerensky. And he was followed by a chap called Gajda. Now, Gajda was a Serb. He'd been in the Austro-Hungarian army. He'd been captured by the Russians. He'd changed sides. He commanded a Montenegrin battalion for a bit. And come the Russian Revolution, he escapes and he joins the Czech Legion. And in July 1918, they were moving along the Trans-Siberian Railway and they were approaching Ekaterinburg. And we talk about that in a moment. Now, the commanders of the White Russians, once they got themselves semi-organized, and they never really got properly organized, but the main commanders were top left, Lieutenant General Yevgeny Ludwig Miller. Miller, it's not a Russian name. He was a Baltic German, 51 years of age. He had served in the Russian Imperial Guard, and he'd been a military attaché in a number of capitals around the world. He had commanded an army on the Eastern Front, a Russian army. When the February Revolution happens, in other words, when the Tsar abdicates, he ordered his soldiers to remove their red armbands, which of course was the signal or the sign of the Soviets. And so they arrested him. He managed to survive. Come the October Revolution, he realizes that there's nothing in it for him, and he manages to get off to Archangel. And from May 1919, he's in command of the White Russians up in North Russia. Second from the left, Lieutenant General Anton Ivanovich Denikin. Now, Denikin was a Pole. Most of Poland, of course, was part of the Russian Empire then. 46 years of age. He looks a bit more than that. He was the son of a serf, which is interesting. His father, a serf, was conscripted, as they were. And in those days, conscription in the Russian army was for life, not like national service in England, which was for 2 years. But the Russian army was for life, or until they got fed up or you were medically unfit or whatever, and they threw you out. He actually served for 25 years, and unusually, he was commissioned. Now, that didn't happen very often. Generally, officers in the Tsarist armies were from the upper branches of society. But he was commissioned after 22 years, and he was an officer for 3 years. He retired as a major. Now, his son, Denikin, Anton Ivanovich Denikin, was commissioned into the artillery. He was a colonel in the Russo-Japanese War, where he did rather well. By 1914, he's a major general. 1916, he's a lieutenant general. Come the revolution, he heads off south with Kornilov. We'll talk about Kornilov a little bit later. And he ends up down in the Caucasus commanding a thing called the Anti-Bolshevik Volunteer Army. Chap in the middle, that's Alexander Kolchak, Admiral Alexander Kolchak, 44. He came from minor Russian nobility. His father had been a major general. In 1916, he was a vice admiral in the Russian Navy, commanding the Black Sea Fleet. He was the youngest of that rank. He was actually a bright boy. Come the revolution, the first revolution in February, Kerensky, remember, president or prime minister, brother of the provisional government, he sends Kolchak to the UK because Kerensky's hoping to get more British support to keep them in the war. And then, of course, there's the October Revolution, or the November Revolution, while Kerensky's in England. So the British then send him to command down in Siberia, because that looks as if where most of the fighting, most of the anti-Bolshevik operations are going to happen along the Trans-Siberian Railway. He becomes head of the white government, such as it was, and commander-in-chief of all the white forces. And his own headquarters is in Omsk, which is along the Trans-Siberian Railway. And then finally, over on the right, that's General Lavrey Georgievich Kornilov. He was 48. He was a Cossack. And again, he served in the Russo Japanese War. He was a colonel there. He'd been the military attaché in China. He spoke Mandarin. By 1915, he's a major general. At one stage, he was captured by the Germans. He escaped back to the Russian army. In February, he's the chap sent along to arrest the Tsarina. He becomes the commander-in-chief of the provisional government, Kerensky's government. He falls out with Kerensky, who sacks him. Along comes the October Revolution, and he escapes off down to the Caucasus. And he initially commands the anti-Bolshevik volunteer army, the one I've just talked about. He was captured in Kuban by the Bolsheviks and shot out of hand. And he was succeeded by Denikin. Denikin took over from him. Down the bottom, the Bolsheviks, Leon Trotsky. He's 39 years of age. He was a Ukrainian Jew, educated in Odessa, fluent speaker of German, English, and French. And he was a very early political agitator against the Tsar. And at one point, he was exiled to Lake Baikal, which is right out in Siberia. He escaped to London in 1900. He and Lenin and a whole lot of other future Bolshevik leaders were all in London. England tended to give refuge, as indeed we still do, to all sorts of extraordinary people. And there they were, plotting away and writing various tracts and books and everything else. They were members of the Russian Socialist Democratic Labour Party. Now, the Russian Socialist Democratic Labour Party split, and it split into two factions, the Mensheviks. Now, the Mensheviks were a broad coalition, centre-left. They weren't extreme. They were certainly socialists, left socialists, but not extremists. And the Bolsheviks. Now, the Bolsheviks were much smaller, very tightly controlled, and they were right on the extreme of the left. They were the communists. And Lenin and Trotsky initially were members of the Mensheviks, that's the broad center-left, but they switched to the Bolsheviks. I think probably they realized that ultimately it would be the Bolsheviks that would run the country and not the Mensheviks. And when the Bolsheviks launched their October Revolution, Trotsky initially became commissar for foreign affairs, the foreign minister, if you like, and then commissar for the army and the navy. He formed the Red Army. Now, a lot of the Bolsheviks felt they remembered the Tsarist army, they resented an army, they didn't want a regular army, they thought it would be oppressive. They wanted a citizens' militia, a sort of part-time, where the workers would pick up their rifle at time of war and go back to their lathe in time of peace. And Trotsky, of course, realized that simply wouldn't work. If Russia wanted to be a power of any significance at all, it had to have a regular army. And his argument won, and he formed the Red Army, which, of course, initially was largely from the Tsars, the remnants of the Tsarist army. It's quite interesting that if you look at the Red Army, the Bolshevik army, at the beginning of the Civil War in 1917-18, 75% of the officers are ex-Tsarist officers. By the end of the Civil War, by 1921-22, 80% of the officers are ex-other ranks, ex-sergeants, sergeant majors. So that's the big shift. Then to his right, that's General Alexei Brusilov. Now, Brusilov was unquestionably, certainly in my view, the Tsar's best general. He was one of the very few competent generals on the Eastern Front. You'll remember the Brusilov offensive. That would have achieved a considerable amount had the army on either flanks done what they should have done, which of course they didn't. So Brusilov was a very competent chap. Come the revolution, he is torn between the monarchy, to whom he's always been loyal, to whom he took an oath, and his country. And he feels that his country would be better served, his nation would be better served if he goes along with the revolution. And he goes along with the Bolsheviks, and he becomes initially their inspector of cavalry and really the main military advisor. So Trotsky is the political head of the armed forces. Brusilov is the professional soldier who advises them what to do. Now, I mentioned that in 1918, the Czech Legion going along the Trans-Siberian Railway were getting nearer and nearer to Ekaterinburg. Now, originally, the Kerensky's government had arrested the Tsar, the now abdicated Tsar and the Tsarina, but they'd put them in very comfortable quarters just outside, in one of his palaces just outside Moscow. The Bolsheviks moved them into Siberia. Ekaterinburg is just, it's the gap in the Urals. It's really where Siberia begins. And they put them there to get them out of the way, so there could be no question of a rescue. They thought that the Czech Legion, getting nearer and nearer Ekaterinburg on the Trans-Siberian Railway, possibly were going to rescue them. Now, it's questionable whether the Czech Legion even knew the Tsar and his family were in Ekaterinburg, and it's also questionable whether they could have cared less. But in any event, the family, July 1918, the whole family were shot, were killed. His brother was caught in November 1918, and he was shot. Now, the house that they were shot in Ekaterinburg, that was knocked down in the 80s when Yeltsin was the governor of that oblast. And the reason it was knocked down was that the Soviet government were worried that it would become a shrine. What they've now done is they've built on top of it what they call the Church of the Holy Blood. And this is a Russian Orthodox church. The bottom story is a church where normal funerals, weddings, mass, and everything else is said. The top story is a memorial to the Tsar and his family. And they have now canonized the Tsar. He's now Saint Nicholas. I have to say that if I was a Russian and I was going to canonize any Tsar, Catherine the Great possibly, Peter the Great possibly, Alexander II perhaps, he freed the Tsars, but certainly not Nicholas II, but I am not a Russian. So that's the end of the Tsar. We mentioned Vladivostok, right over on the Pacific, and that was the main port for stuff coming in, particularly from America. And the Japanese, of course. The Japanese landed in Vladivostok. 25th Middlesex from Hong Kong landed in Vladivostok. The French landed a colonial battalion there, and that was the main port, not the main port, one of the main ports for the Americans. The Americans had landed troops up in Archangel, and now they're landing troops in Vladivostok. That is a photograph of the Americans debussing or disembarking in Vladivostok. And there's a great build-up of Allied troops in Vladivostok. And in September, there's a parade. That's a parade of them in September. I think those are the Japanese marching by the look of them. And the decision is to mount an Allied Siberian expedition, more Allied in name than in practice. The Japanese say, yeah, we'll take part of it. 70,000 troops, the Japanese said they'd provide for the Allied Siberian expedition. The Czech Legion are there, of course. There are 60,000 of them. The United States, altogether 6 battalions plus volunteers. Canada, 2 battalions, Squadron of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, artillery and logistics units. Chinese, 2,300 Chinese. Italy, 1,500. They're mainly made up of prisoners of war who, of course, have been released once the war is over and shipped round to Vladivostok. And the UK contribution will be 2 battalions, plus, of course, the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force, and 800 Frenchmen. Now, the Japanese absolutely have their own agenda. They're not really interested in having anything to do with the Allies. Their plan is to annex the maritime province of Siberia. In other words, the bit of Siberia that's opposite Japan, and the bit that runs right down to south to Vladivostok, their intention was to annex that. They'd already got Korea. Korea was annexed by the Japanese in 1910, and the idea was to add a bit more, bit of China plus a bit of Russia. So they're not really having very much to do with it. The Czech Legion, well, they're mainly looking after the railway. They're interested in controlling that. The Americans have said they're quite happy to guard stores. They'll repatriate American citizens. They're not really interested in fighting, although, of course, the people that the Americans had originally sent in to sort out the railways, not the Trans-Siberian Railway, but the railways in European Russia, they, of course, are still there trying to get the railways to work. Canada sent 2 battalions, 259th and the 260th battalions, and they're going to guard and police Vladivostok. A company goes up to Omsk, because that's where the British mission sets its headquarters, and the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, who are on horseback, they will police Vladivostok and sort that out. Chinese, their view is that they will guard Chinese businesses and they're not going to do anything else. The Italians, they are mainly provided to assist on the railway, assist the Czech Legion and the various people running the railway, and they will provide guards for the railway as well. The UK support to Kolchak, because Kolchak's got to be running this thing. Initially, it's training. I mean, that's what the British do best. Later on, rather reluctantly, the British do get involved in combat. Most British troops are up in the north, up in Murmansk and Archangel, but there are some down in the south. The French, again, very much involved in training and assistance and advice rather than actual combat. And of course, guarding French businesses, which there are a considerable number in that part of Russia. Kolchak's army. Now, when come the revolution, about 8,000 officers escaped to Siberia, Tsarist officers, where they immediately started conscripting 18 and 19-year-old locals who weren't terribly happy to be conscripted. They, of course, were not veterans. The officers were, but the troops weren't, so they weren't entirely reliable. But they did manage, by September 1918, they got 38,000 troops. They'd got 70 artillery pieces provided by the British, and they were going to be commanded by Lieutenant General Bolshev. Now, Bolshev was good, knew what he was doing, knew the problems of these conscripts, that he had to treat them with a fairly gentle hand. He fell out with Kolchak, and he was replaced by a 36-year-old Colonel Lebedev, and that was a mistake, because Lebedev had no nonsense about it. Lebedev said, you treat them in the way we've always treated Russian soldiers. If they don't do it, we tell them, we punch them. The British also raised a thing called the Anglo-Russian Regiment. Now, one of the things the British have always been good at is organizing and commanding troops not of their own race. It didn't really work in this case. The idea was it would be Russian soldiers, and the Hampshire Regiment, British Hampshires, would provide the officers and the NCOs. And they duly began to train them. And the problem was that any time one of these Russian soldiers from the Anglo-Russian Regiment went anywhere near a white Russian officer and saluted him, the white Russians would grab him and beat him up for saluting in the British fashion, not in the Russian fashion. Well, of course, they've been trained by the British, so of course they did British drill. Thumping was perfectly normal in the Russian army. That's what they did. It's what they still do. If a soldier does something an officer doesn't like, an officer will punch him and get away with it. It's an extraordinary way to run an army. I mean, I have to say that in 35 years service or something, I've never, ever had to hit a soldier, and the soldiers never hit me, at least not on our own side. So that was one of the problems. Eventually, in June 1919, the British realized that actually they might be very good at running regiments of Indians or anything else, but the experiment of the Russians wasn't working, so they gave it up, and the Anglo-Russian regiment was disbanded. There was, however, a British liaison mission to Kolchak, commanded by Major General Sir Alfred Knox. Now, Knox was a Russian speaker. He'd been the military attaché in Petrograd, the capital of Russia, so he knew the Russians, knew the form, and he was there really to try and keep Kolchak on the right track and try and get these disparate allied contingents all working together. He wasn't always successful through no fault of his own. Well, Kolchak's advance along the Trans-Siberian Railway starts up here on what is called the Ussuri River front, and that involves the 25th Middlesex British Battalion, an armoured train, and the Royal Navy providing shore bombardment. And that's pretty successful. And they start to move on up the Trans-Siberian Railway, up to Lake Baikal, which is up here. Both the Japanese, who are really doing their own thing in the area, but coming along to the right, and the White Russians shot prisoners of war, as indeed did the Bolsheviks. The British tried to stop it. They couldn't. There was a case where a Royal Air Force aircraft was shot down in Russian Bolshevik-controlled territory. His wingman landed as well to see if he could help. The two pilots were taken out by the Bolsheviks and shot. That was that. There was really no quarter given. It happens in civil wars are usually far nastier than any other sort of war. Well, Kolchak eventually, I'm sorry about this rather busy slide. Basically, the Reds are where there were Bolshevik units, Ussuri River front, beaten on up. Eventually, Kolchak gets up to Chelyabinsk up here, so he's doing pretty well. He does, in fact, even capture Ufasa, which is up here. Then the Soviets, the Bolsheviks, counterattack. He's pushed back to Chelyabinsk. And then the Bolshevik counterattacks, more and more and more counterattacks. A British armored train, which is up there supporting Kolchak, is almost captured. What happens is they run out of water. Now, of course, you need water to make a steam to make the thing go, and no water. So what they started to do was shovel snow into the boiler. Now, as you know, a lot of snow produces a very small amount of water. So there they are, shoveling away. Eventually, just at last, they get enough snow, which turns into water to give them enough steam to get going, and they just avoid being captured. Well, that was really the farthest that Kolchak got. Chelyabinsk up here. Now he's being pushed back. The Reds recapture Ufas, which he'd taken up here, and there is now a general withdrawal. They called it a withdrawal. Actually, it was a retreat all the way back down the Trans-Siberian Railway. Armored trains, both sides now are using armored trains. The ones used by the British have got Royal Navy guns mounted on them. The ones used by the Bolsheviks have got French guns, because originally the Tsarist army was given a whole quantity of French artillery in exchange for sending 2 Russian divisions to the Western Front, which you will know about. Interesting story by itself. So eventually there is a halt at Lake Baikal. So from Baikal back to Vladivostok, the Whites have still got it. And the fighting goes backwards and forwards for a bit. Eventually, the British begin to see that actually this really isn't working. And the British battalions are withdrawn back to Vladivostok. And Kolchak's offensive really is now run out of steam. Omsk up here, which is where the British advisory team were, that's captured by the Bolsheviks. The team, of course, has got out of it. They've gone back to Vladivostok. And in December 1919, British troops are withdrawn from Vladivostok by the Royal Navy. So the only British troops now left down here are the mission to Kolchak, which is Knox and 250 all ranks, and the river gunboat crews of the Royal Navy. The problem really is that the line is a single line. It becomes congested. You get trains trying to go up, trains trying to come down, great arguments as to who goes into a siding and who doesn't. One armored train actually was captured by the Bolsheviks. The British crew managed to get out. Kolchak himself gets to Irkutsk, which is here just by Lake Baikal. The train is surrounded by the locals, who of course are sympathetic to the Bolsheviks. Kolchak is pulled out, he's shot, and his body is thrown through a hole in the ice in Lake Baikal. Command now devolves to Denikin. He is now the commander, so-called, of all the White Russian forces. There is now, in Irkutsk, a statue to Kolchak. Now, when I first saw this a few years ago, I said to my Russian chum, I took this photograph in 2019, I think it was, but it's been up for a good few years before that. And the first time I saw it, which was about 2014, I think, and I said to my Russian chum, what is this? Because in Irkutsk, you walk up Lenin Prospect and you cross Karl Marx Alley, and there's a statue of Kolchak. And my Russian mate said, well, we're trying to get a grip. We're trying to sort out our history. He said, we are a country with an unpredictable past. Most countries have an unpredictable future. Russia has an unpredictable past. He said, I learned one theory, one version of Russian history under Stalin. He said, I learned another version under Khrushchev. I learned a third version under Gorbachev, and I'm now learning a fourth version under Putin. So they are desperately trying to sort out their history, and it's really quite comical in some ways, and really quite extraordinary in others. But there is now Kolchak has now been rehabilitated, if you like. The British troops have now withdrawn from Vladivostok. They're still in Murmansk for a bit, and the Royal Navy are still around. This is as far as any of them got. Now, if you were just looking at this, that's as far as Kolchak got. Denikin coming up there from the Caucasus, the Poles over here, and then you've got Miller up here coming down from Archangel and Murmansk. So that looks pretty good. You know, they're all closing in on Moscow, but that is as far as they got. The whole thing has run out of steam. The Japanese stay. The March 1920, American troops are withdrawn. They leave. The Royal Navy stays until 1922, basically rescuing people in both the Baltic and the Black Sea. The Japanese stay until 22. The Allies leave Murmansk in October 1919, except, as I say, for the mission and the Royal Navy. But there are lots of little battles that happen all over the place that have been forgotten. They're not in the history books. One took place here at what is now called Volgograd. Now, Volgograd, of course, it was Stalingrad, and then it was Tsaritsyn. It was renamed from Tsaritsyn to Stalingrad because Stalin was supposedly there during this first little battle that I'm going to mention now. We all, of course, know about the Second World War Battle of Stalingrad. This was the First World War, or post-First World War. And it was the whites attacking the Bolsheviks who were in Tsaritsyn, as it was still called. The white force was led by British tanks, a troop of tanks. There was only enough petrol for one tank. So that one tank was going to lead the attack of the White Russians. And that tank was going to be manned, or was manned, by a Major Bruce. Now, Bruce had lost his left arm. This picture is of him as a subaltern before he loses his arm. Lost his left arm on the Western Front. He had won the Military Cross and the DSO, and he led this attack in this British tank, and they chased the Bolsheviks out of it. It was said that Stalin put up a rearguard action. He may or may not have been there, but that's why Tsaritsyn was renamed Stalingrad, by which time Stalin has become secretary to Lenin and effectively the most influential chap next to Lenin in the Communist Bolshevik Party. So Bruce has done terribly well. He did very well on the Western Front, and he's done very well here as part of the Allied intervention force. And then it all goes wrong. He leaves the army after the war, as most people did, most wartime people did, and he joins the Royal Irish Constabulary Auxiliaries, an organization that did not have a particularly good reputation. He was sacked from that for striking a civilian. In December 1920, he's in court for robbery. He holds up a shop, and he's sentenced to a year in prison. And when he comes out of that, he goes bankrupt. And in 1925, he dies of double pneumonia. It's a desperately sad story. Here is a young man who showed great gallantry, great bravery. And the war ends, and he doesn't know what he's doing. He's rootless, and it all goes wrong. But there were lots of little battles. They didn't all end up as sadly as that one did. So by the end of 1922, the Bolsheviks are in control really of the whole of Russia and the Caucasus. The casualties, well, as I said, the Russians probably 500,000 dead, British 359 killed, Americans 279 killed. The other participants, French, etc., not so many, a couple of hundred here and there. And of course, there were more deaths from typhus, which hit a lot of the units, and of course from so-called Spanish flu. So why did the whites lose? Well, for a start, there was no civilian administration. They went into an area, they kicked the Bolsheviks out, but instead of then consolidating and establishing a civil government, a local government, they didn't. They just ignored them. They handed the land, any land that they recaptured, they handed it over to the original owners. Now, of course, the Bolsheviks had given it to the peasants who worked on it. So when the peasants found the land wasn't theirs anymore, it had been given back to the original nobles, the boyars, the great landowners, that really didn't endear them to the whites. In fact, the whites did absolutely nothing for the peasants. They didn't promise them anything. They didn't do anything for them. The economy, well, the White Russians had no money. There was no money to spend on improving the areas that they did manage to reclaim. There was huge chicanery going on logistically, kit being sold, rations being sold. There was a great black market going on. And I suppose the second biggest reason was that none of the white commanders could get their act. They could not coordinate. They were all falling out with each other. They're quite happy to drop each other in the poo. They'd never, ever, however hard Kolchak tried, and he did try, he was never able to get the various commanders to agree on what to do. But the main reason why the whites lost, I think, was that the population had had enough. They were fed up. They'd gone through the Eastern Front, the First World War. It was awful if you happened to be a Russian, whether you were a soldier or a civilian. And now the Civil War. Once again, armies are going backwards and forwards, looting, destroying, burning. They wanted peace at any price. They don't care who wins. They don't care if it's the Tsar, if it's the Mensheviks, the Bolsheviks, whoever. They want peace. And I think that was the main reason that the whites lost. There was, of course, a certain amount of reluctance amongst the Allies, although they provided the Allied intervention force. They never really provided enough troops to really make a significant difference. They hoped that they could simply train and finance, but that wasn't enough. As far as the white Russian commanders were concerned, Miller, the Baltic German, he managed to get away to Paris, and he was settled perfectly happy in Paris. And in 1939, the Soviets sent a snatch squad into Paris, kidnapped him, took him back to Moscow, and shot him. Denikin, he died in the United States of America in 1947. Now, again, as part of this business of trying to come to terms with their history, Putin had him repatriated. His body was repatriated to Russia, and he's buried in Moscow. Kornilov was killed by a shell in Kuban, buried. The Bolsheviks disinterred his body and burnt it, so there's nothing left there. On the Bolshevik side, Trotsky, of course, he was, in January 1925, he was sacked as the commissar for the army and the navy. There's always been anti-Semitism in Russia under the Tsars or under the Bolsheviks. And while the Bolsheviks tried to pretend that all that was gone, and a lot of the initial Bolsheviks were Jews, inevitably that sort of traditional anti-Semitism crept in. Trotsky was sacked in 1925, 1927. He's expelled from the Central Committee, the controlling committee of the Communist Party, controlling committee of the government, if you like. November 1927, he's kicked out of the Communist Party. He's not even a party member. 1928, January, he's exiled to Alma-Ata. Now, that's in Kazakhstan. That's way down in the Caucasus, part of what the old Silk Road. And then in February 1929, he's expelled from the USSR. And he goes to Turkey, then to France, then to Norway, and eventually he settles in Mexico in January 1937. And in August 1940, he's assassinated by a Soviet agent. And you'll probably remember he was actually killed with an ice pick. Brusilov, remember the Tsar's best general and also the Bolsheviks' best general, he survived. He became Inspector General of Cavalry of the Red Army after the Civil War. He retired age 70. He died in 1926, age 72. And he's buried, is buried in Moscow, buried with honors. So that's a brief romp round what was really a very disorganized and quite difficult to sort of get a grip of the Russian Civil War, but particularly I've emphasized the Allied intervention force. And if there are any questions, I will, of course, be delighted to try and answer them. But thank you very much indeed for listening. And I see that the staff has just appeared with a gin and tonic. Thank you very much, my dear.
Tremendous. Thanks ever so much indeed, Gordon. That was very interesting indeed. Very illuminating talk on a subject that, well, personally, I knew nothing about it. I don't know if others also enjoyed that. Would we perhaps do the usual of a silent round of applause by hitting the raise hands button on the Zoom underneath? Zoom button underneath the screen there, and I can confirm, Gordon, that there's hundreds of hands going up, so that is a silent but nevertheless heartfelt round of applause from everybody who's watched. So thanks for that. We've already got half a dozen questions in, so I think we're going to have a lively Q&A session. I think it might be appropriate, possibly, Gordon, for us also to extend it to, if anybody's got any particular questions about the current situation in Russia and Ukraine, we might try and touch on that as well, but we'll try and do the First World War, the immediate post-First World War questions first, before we actually get everybody up onto the screen who's got questions. If there's any counterfactual history you might like to comment on, it might be a very broad question, it might be a daft question, but I'm just wondering what would have happened, do you think, if the Whites had won in terms of post-Second World War and post-Second World War history?
I think it would have fallen apart eventually, because who was going to run the country? All these various white commanders, they all had different agendas. Some of them wanted to bring back the Tsar. They wanted an absolute monarchy. Some wanted a constitutional monarchy along the British pattern. And in fact, that had been something that a lot of Russians had wanted for a very long time. I mean, the December Revolution, a lot of the officers involved in that, way back, the Decembrists, one of their points was a constitutional monarchy. They'd liked the British system, and that's what they wanted. Then there were Republicans, there were socialists of varying degree. I think the whole thing would have fallen apart. I mean, I think the main reason they didn't was the population. The population just wanted peace at any price. I mean, let's say Kolchak had survived, and let's say Kolchak had won, and Kolchak had become the presumably the president of Russia. I think there would have been a lot of opposition of one sort or another to him. And I think in a sense, Bolshevism, communism was, given the context, I think it was almost inevitable that would happen. That said, going off on a tangent, I think if the Great Depression hadn't happened and the Weimar Republic had survived, the Second World War would still have happened, in my opinion, and it would have been Britain, France, and Germany versus Bolshevik versus the USSR. Because in the 30s, everybody was terrified of Bolshevism. It wasn't Nazism they were terrified of, it was Bolshevism. And of course, the Weimar Republic was as democratic a constitution as Germany ever had. But that's just speculation. So to get back to your original question, what would have happened if the Whites had won? I think it would still have fallen apart, probably.
That's grand. Thanks for that, Gordon. That's given me some breathing space to get some people up on the screen there. So thanks for that counterfactual theorising there. Let's go for Christopher Nash first of all. Christopher did have one question, and Peter Newnham has got two questions, one of which is identical to Christopher's. So Christopher, so Peter, you hit your two questions, one of which was Christopher's anyway.
My first question was around the extent to which there was parliamentary support for British intervention in Russia, or indeed whether there was parliamentary or political opposition or more broadly public opposition to it.
There was a considerable amount of public opposition. Harry Pollitt, of course, who was a communist and a very competent orator, he was going around particularly amongst the workers, factory workers and the rest, trying to persuade them to prevent any exports of material to the White Russians. There was also a Mrs. Walker, and nobody's really ever been able to work out who Mrs. Walker was. She was a woman. Again, was a rabble rouser, is probably unfair, but she was again trying to make sure that, particularly with the dockers, that they wouldn't load ships for Russia. It's difficult to know just how widespread that was. There wasn't any appetite in England at the time for Bolshevism, communism as such, but there was very much an appetite for liberalism. We'd just finished a war against an autocrat, the Kaiser and his chaps, and of course the Tsar was an autocrat. A lot of people felt that good riddance to the Tsar. The same in America, where President Wilson said, well, when the Tsar abdicated, he said, well, at least now all the Allies are Democrats. Well, they weren't really democratic, but they weren't as autocratic as they had been. So there was feeling in Parliament, the majority, because the government supported it, so they had a majority, but there was a significant minority that was against it, both in the public and in Parliament.
Thank you for that. My other question was about Trotsky. Could you say a few words about his capabilities as a military commander, a Red Army commander?
He was an organizer. Now, he wasn't a soldier, but he was an organizer. And he was the chap who realized that a citizens' militia doesn't work. You occasionally hear this, people saying, well, the way to run your defenses is to have a citizens' militia, because that's entirely democratic, and therefore the army can't be used to oppress the populace. It doesn't work. It's a bit like saying, in our context, and this is no criticism of the Army Reserve, but it's a bit like saying disband the regular army and we'll rely entirely on the TA, the Army Reserve. Through no fault of theirs, it wouldn't work. It couldn't work. It might work in somewhere like Luxembourg, where in 1914 the postmen became soldiers. But you can do that in a tiny little country like Luxembourg. You can't do it in Russia. So he had the ability to see that you needed a regular army, and he saw how to organize it. He wasn't himself a soldier in the sense of commanding men in battle, but he was an organizer. He was a good organizer. He knew who to pick, who to put in particular positions. And with Brusilov to advise him as to the military things you needed to do, that was his great strength. He was a great loss to the Bolsheviks when they turned against him for all sorts of reasons. Stalin was very anti-Trotsky, probably because he saw Trotsky as a competitor. And of course, they were able to stir up the anti-Semitism that's always been there in Russian society. And he was a loss to them, there's no question. He was also an intellectual. He'd been in England for quite a long time. He knew how the West worked. Stalin had never been in England, had never been out of Russia. So he was a considerable loss. And the West could have done business with Trotsky, I think, whereas they couldn't necessarily have done business with Stalin.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Thanks for your question, Peter. Right, next up, David Muir. David, do you just want to mute yourself there?
Right, thank you very much, Gordon. I've also got two questions. There's one white general that you omitted to mention, Wrangel or Wrangel, I'm not sure quite how you'd pronounce it. Is there any particular reason for this? And secondly, anecdotally, the Royal Marines have a tradition of never having mutinied, but I have seen suggestions that there were at least some rather dubious incidents in the Baltic area during the intervention period. Can you comment on those?
Yeah. Yeah, Wrangel was one of the. He'd been, of course, a Tsarist officer, and he was indeed one of the. I think he was quite sure. I think he was somewhere down in the Caucasus. I'm not absolutely certain about that. I did read a biography of him years ago. The question of insubordination, and I think to call them mutinies is probably going a bit too far, but there was certainly unrest, both in the Royal Navy and in the infantry. The soldiers, many of them, of course, been conscripted for the war, or they had joined as volunteers for the war. The war's over. Why aren't we going home? Well, what are we doing in Russia? This has nothing to do with us, they thought. And there was never an outright mutiny. I mean, nobody ever sort of shot their officers or refused to, refused to parade. But there was certainly unrest. I think what worried the government was not so much the unrest in the army, because they were conscripts. Of course, they felt they should be going home, fully understandable. They were worried about unrest in the Navy, because the Navy was the defense of England. I mean, traditionally, historically, always has been. And the Navy were very largely still regular soldiers, or regular sailors. So that was a worry. And that, combined with the fact that there was significant opposition, public opposition to the whole thing, and a minority, but nevertheless a significant minority in Parliament opposed to it, was part of the reason why the whole thing really was half-hearted. I mean, we never really put enough. Bear in mind, we've just finished the First World War. We've got a huge army. We never actually put enough in to really make a difference. And this is you're absolutely right. This is all connected. Now, I haven't heard about unrest amongst the Marines, the Royal Marines, but certainly there was certainly unrest in the Royal Navy, the sailors, and in the army, not just amongst the British, but amongst other units as well, who felt, we joined for the war, fighting the Germans, war's over, why aren't we going home? What are we doing? What are we doing here? I can't remember what the question was. What was the question before?
I think you're more or less there, Gordon, to be honest.
Okay.
Yes, I think that pretty well covers it. I mean, I have seen, again, anecdotal evidence that some Marines were involved in this, but there again, as you say, mutiny, there's the difference between an individual who rebels and mass mutiny.
Yeah, I mean, mutiny, as you know, is a one man can't mutiny. The definition of mutiny, it has to be a collective thing.
Thanks for that. I think we've explored David's question there. Let's turn to the next question from Gordon Holmes. Gordon, do you want to mute yourself there?
Thank you, David. Excellent presentation, Gordon, most enlightening. My question is, did we, the British, directly come up against the Red Army or the infamous International Brigade at any point after 1917? Or were they just left to the Russians, and were we just a policing element?
We were mainly, it starts off with training, and then it's support, where you put what British troops we have behind the White Russians. And occasionally we get into combat. But that doesn't happen very often. The initial push when up at Murmansk, when the Bolsheviks are advancing on Murmansk, they're pushed back. That's a British involvement. That's it. Then it's most of it up there is the White Russians. Similarly, Siberia, the initial Ussuri, from Vladivostok up north, that's British. But after that, it's largely White Russians. The British really didn't want to get involved in
No, I can appreciate. What was the part played by the International Brigade? I understand they were recruited from German and Austrian prisoners of war.
Well, there were a whole lot of I mean, international brigades as such. I mean, they weren't actually called the International Brigade, but there were things like the Slav Legion, the Allied Slav Legion, and various other things, recruited from anybody they could get. I mean, some of them were, quite frankly, were mercenaries and nothing much more than that.
But the British government tried to attack Russia from the back door, really, didn't they? Got the likes of Sidney Reilly and George Hill, Ransom, Lockhart, and Cumming, all as working undercover in and around Russia.
Well, yes,
in and around Moscow.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a separate issue. That was MI6. That was intelligence gathering and trying to defray the Bolshevik Revolution. People, Riley particularly, but there were lots of others, which wasn't quite the same thing. They really weren't involved with the Allied intervention force.
Were they not? They weren't specifically there to subvert the Bolshevik government then?
Oh yes, they certainly, yes, they were. Yeah, but not by military means.
Right, yeah, that by skullduggery. Your comment with regard to the French, Germany, and the British tackling the Russians after the Second World War, that was a point muted by General Patton, I think, wasn't it? He suggested that that's what could have happened.
Yeah, he did. If Patton hadn't been killed in a car accident, Truman would have had to have sacked him. Yeah, Patton, commanding the American occupation army in Germany, went around to anybody who would listen publicly saying, right, what we'll do is we'll rearm the Wehrmacht and they and us and the British will march on Moscow. Now, in hindsight, a bit like MacArthur saying, let's nuke the Chinese back into the Stone Age, they may well have been right, but it was out of the question that would happen. I mean, the British and the Americans, the French, they'd fought the Second World War, 7 years.
Left.
They're not going to go on and start another war. It's just not going to happen. So
but he would have characterized himself. He would have another over the pawn shop for punching private soldiers as well, I believe.
Yeah, he did. He in Sicily. He slapped a psychiatric case, and the journalists who were there all agreed they would say nothing about it, except for Drew Pearson. And Drew Pearson, who of course became quite famous after the war as a journalist. Well, I can remember Drew Pearson. He's not all that long dead, and he was the chap who blew it. And there was a frightful fuss, as there should be. And Patton was sort of taken out of the system for a bit, which all became a bit embarrassing because in North Africa, Bradley was under Patton. Switched to Normandy, it's the other way around. Patton is under Bradley, which didn't help the relationship.
No, so there would have been tension there.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Gordon. That was an excellent presentation, and thank you for answering the questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Gordon. Thanks. Peter, do you want to unmute yourself there?
In military doctrine, interior lines and unity of command are important factors. Would it be true to say that this was a major issue here? Because my understanding is that Admiral Kolchak couldn't actually physically he couldn't communicate physically with any of his commanders. I mean, there was, I think, Udenich on the Baltic front and Denikin in the south.
Yeah, I think you've answered your question. You're absolutely right. Unity of command wasn't there. Kolchak was supposedly the commander-in-chief of all the armies, but communicating with Denikin, for example, or Miller up in the north, by the time he got an order or instruction or anything else up there, which took several days by telegraph going all sort of around the place, the situation had moved on. The exterior lines, of course, advancing from Vladivostok, the further they went, the longer their lines stretched. Similarly, when the Russians were coming back, so you got the sort of backwards and forwards. But unity of command which is vital, and one of the problems that the Russians had in Ukraine recently, and they didn't have it. But as you rightly say, Kolchak could not enforce what he wanted with the people in the north, or indeed the Poles over in the west. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And may I say, sir, my moustache used to be as good as yours when I was your age. You're now it's much better than mine.
Thanks for your question there, Peter. Right, we've got another couple of questions that have come in, but neither of these gentlemen have got microphones. So Steve Mason asks, when was the murder of the Tsar and his family made known? And if so, did it have any effect on the morale of either side?
It was initially, it took quite some time for the Soviets to admit. The Soviets were quite worried because it was probably the local lad who made the decision rather than the people back in Moscow. And they weren't quite sure what to say. And eventually they put out all sorts of rubbish about that he was tried for treason and everything else. And it certainly took some time before it seeped out. Of course, it did seep out because, like anything else, if more than one person is involved, eventually the truth will get out. But they were always slightly shifty about it. They didn't seem to have any problem about shooting captured whites. You know, they said they're traitors, shoot them. They were a bit shifty about what they'd done to the Tsar, particularly, of course, the kids, the children, the daughters. So it came out eventually. They put up all sorts of stories. Initially, they said, "Oh no, it wasn't their decision. Who's this chap locally?" And then eventually they had to decide, well, actually, you know, we've got to take responsibility. But there was all sorts of obfuscation and different stories flying about, and they were always a bit shifty about it. And I think probably it's why the post 91, you know, the post collapse of the Soviet Union, made so much efforts to try and find the bodies and identify them and bring them back. They're now buried in Peter and Paul Fortress in Moscow. What is in St. Petersburg? What is interesting? I went to see it, and all the Tsars are buried in one room, one great big chamber, and Nicholas is buried in an offshoot of that same room. And I said to them, "Now you've got all the Tsars here. Why is he not here?" And they said, "Well, because he wasn't the Tsar when he was murdered. That's why he's separate." But again, you know, they're desperately trying to come to terms with it. Oh, they were. I think things have changed recently, but
they've probably got other things on the mind right now. Thanks for that, Gordon. Right, another question again from somebody without a microphone, and it's from Philip Andrews. And Philip asks the following: Gordon, although it operated in the Caucasus, Azerbaijan, rather than Russia, do we have an opinion on the effectiveness or otherwise of Dunster Force? Philip has read Dunsterville's book, The Adventures of Dunster Force, some time ago, and it seemed, possibly naturally, very one-sided, saying how wonderful the force was. That's from Philip Andrews.
Yeah, Philip, Dunster Force, of course, originally was anti-Turkish. Turkey was still in the war, and that's what they were there for. And also, it was a question of course, Armenia was part of the Russian Empire then. So the fighting is in what is now Azerbaijan, what is now Armenia, against the Turks. And then when the Turks are out of the war, part of Dunster Force becomes the North Persian Force and then starts looking into Russia rather than in Azerbaijan and Armenia. It was a sideshow, and therefore he didn't get the cream of the British Army or the Indian Army. It was very much a sideshow. I think I've probably read the same book, and I think I agree that there's a certain amount of, you emphasize the good things and forget the bad things. As somebody once said, there's lies, damned lies, and regimental histories.
Nice one. Okay, thanks for that. Okay, time's ticking on, and so we'll come to our last question, which is probably appropriate for us to deal with this last, because it's about the current situation. Jonathan, if you want to, I think you might be unmuted there. Do you want to fire any question there?
Yeah, hi, thanks. That was a fantastic talk, and I've been a WFA member for a long time, but since February I've been involved in a thing called Maria Report, which is it's like a Zoom call that runs 24/7, actually, on Twitter, a thing called Twitter Spaces. A lot of military people involved, basically doing everything they can to help people in Ukraine. Many people over there, actually, and Ukrainians calling in all the time. So if anybody's interested in that, it's a great thing to drop into. It's 24/7 live on Twitter Spaces, Maria Report. So my question is, what's your take on the situation? Can either side achieve its aims? How long do you think it might last? How might it end? And has your research into the Civil War sort of shed any light on the current situation?
Right. First of all, because we haven't got too much time left, if you go on to Substack, Substack is an American website, but it allows authors to post. I post a newsletter there every Sunday. And if you go on to Substack and look for Major Gordon Corrigan's newsletter, I've got a lot of stuff up there on Ukraine and what's happening in the Ukraine war. To answer your question, either Russian intelligence, the GRU particularly, are incompetent, I don't think they are, or they were terrified to tell Putin the truth, because it's quite clear that the Russians, or Putin certainly, and presumably his generals, who should have known better, thought that the whole thing would be dead simple. You come out from Belarus, you head for Kiev, you chuck out the current government, you put in a puppet government, and it's all over in a weekend. And of course, that didn't happen. They, as you know, they initially tried to take the airport. That was quite sensible. You take an airport, then you can fly in troops, vehicles, and everything else. They got their head kicked in. They then tried to send an armored column from Belarus. Now, the stupidest lance corporal could have said to them, you do not send tanks nose to tail along a road through a forested area, because that allows anti-tank ambushes to happen. And people say, why couldn't they get off the road? They couldn't get off the road because the spring thaw had happened early. Now, if they'd studied what happened in both world wars, they'd have known that. They couldn't go off the road because they got bogged in. And thanks to the wonderful N-Law, which is being supplied to them, it's made in Belfast. It's a Swedish weapon, which is made by the British under license. Now, when I was commanding our depot, the Gurkha depot, our soldiers had one 40-minute period in a classroom, and then they took this thing, they went out onto range and fired at a tank, not a Russian tank, a tank on a range. So the point is, it's a highly sophisticated piece of kit. It's dead easy to train. You can train people. We trained our chaps one period. And that's what's blowing the turrets off the T-72, which is an old tank. Where's the T-90? Where is the T-14? Who the hell knows? The Ukrainians don't have to win this war. They have to not lose it, if that makes sense. The Russians will now revert to their historic, traditional way of waging war: artillery, masses of artillery, masses of missiles, and when they've reduced the area to rubble, in will go increasingly young, increasingly untrained, increasingly reluctant conscripts. That's what's been happening. The behavior of the Russian army in areas that they did take, a properly organized army does not shoot civilians for no reason, does not rape, does not loot, does not leave kit lying all over the place when it withdraws. The Russian army is in a bad state. They should have learnt the lesson from the 2008 Georgian War, when the radios didn't work, the vehicles broke down, etc., etc. And they then spent or allocated a huge amount of money towards modernizing the army, bringing it up to date, sorting out the problems. Where's that money gone? It's obviously gone into somebody's back pocket, because what I can see from the Russian army performance now, they have not improved. They're in an awful state. The worry, of course, is, would he use tactical nuclear weapons? Probably not. He might, if he thinks he's losing. If he thinks the polity of Russia is at stake, he might. I think there are probably more sensible people around him who would prevent him from doing that. I must say I was wrong here. I thought that at the beginning, when the generals realized they'd been pushed into a war that they couldn't win quickly and they couldn't win easily, they'd remove him. That hasn't happened. Clearly, his security organization is better than that. Suvorkin, who's actually, well, he was originally an army general, then an air force general, now the commander-in-chief in the Ukraine. It's too early to see what he's going to do. But I think we're in for a long war, and I think it will reduce almost to the First World War. We've got lines of defenses, shelling each other, not a lot of movement. And certainly that will happen throughout the winter. Come the spring, the Russians, they've just had another mobilization, calling up reserves, very unpopular. People are legging it into the woods to avoid it, emigrating to avoid it, etc. It may be when the mothers of Russian soldiers see the body bags coming back, that may bring some pressure upon them. Very, very difficult. It's always terribly difficult to make predictions, because you're probably going to be wrong. But I go back to saying that what is vital, what is absolutely vital, is that I don't know what the state is in the United States or in Canada, but here in England, our price of energy has gone through the roof because of what's happening in Ukraine, and more so in Europe, more so in France and Germany. And what mustn't happen is that because the poor are eating their children and burning their furniture, or whatever the tabloids are telling us, that pressure is put on governments to tell the Ukrainians to negotiate. That would be fatal. If we do that, if Russia thinks that they can get away with it because the Brits won't put on another pullover to stand, for the cold or whatever, then the next step will be to try to hit the Baltic states back. And that's Article 5. That's war with NATO. That's the Third World War. So it's really important that all the Western governments, and that really means the British and Americans, because they're the major supporters of the Ukraine. It's really important that we continue to support the Ukraine as much as we possibly can. They must not lose this war.
Yeah, you'd be very welcome on the Twitter Spaces. It's a friendly place. There's a lot of pretty high level military people from America and Canada and UK as well. Lots of journalists. John Sweeney's been on, a few others, and it's a fascinating thing, because it's, like you say, it's kind of regressing to the First World War, which is my sort of area of history. So it's now and it's then, and yeah, it's thank you. It's really delving into the Russian part of it. This is why this was so interesting to me, because it brings the two together, my sort of two areas, and delving into the Bloodlands and other books like that have been a fascinating read. To sort of get a grasp of that. It's such a massive area of history that we don't really learn much about in British schools until now, I think. So thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Right. Okay. So I think, ladies and gentlemen, it's now well past 9:30, which is normally the bewitching hour for these webinars. So a final thank you to Gordon. If we can raise our hands in the usual ways, a final round of applause for the presentation and the very extensive Q&As that have evolved out of that. And Gordon, I can confirm once again that we've got loads of hands going up as a silent round of applause. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all for tonight. That's all from the Western Front Association's webinar for tonight. We've got some more in January. We're not going to be running any more webinars over Christmas, so I wish everybody, Gordon and everybody watching, a happy Christmas, and see everybody in the new year. Gordon, once again, many thanks for tonight.
Thank you very much, and happy Christmas to you all. And 2023 has got to be better than 2022.
Let's
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Good night.
Mademoiselle from Armentières.